I was just going to. Okay. I was just going
Hey,
to ask
everybody.
you.
I'm here with Noel Plum. We're doing a hangout. We're going to be talking a little bit about Jordan Peterson and specifically on the last Sam Harris podcast. And I did a hangout with Noel, with Owen McDonald about feminism, a little bit of a debate kind of discussion. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit. Did you want to say something, Noel?
Yeah, it was just, one of these questions where you think, actually, I don't really know how to refer to you. Do you just want to be referred to as friended, or
My
do you
name
have
is
a
Adam. You can call me Adam or
Adam?
friend,
Adam,
either
right?
one.
Adam's fine. Yeah, I mean, I don't, some people have different ideas on using their
I see
names
yours.
online.
I
So.
see your screen name too, so I technically know your first name, but I don't. Do
Yeah, I
people
mean, no, I
know?
use Jim online as well as Noel. Really, it's just an.
Okay. Do you have a preference?
No, stick with Noel. I think more people know me online as Noel. It's one of those things, YouTube's one of those beasts where you spend 10 seconds coming up with a username, not realizing that you're going to be living with it in such a capacity, perhaps
See, but I've
almost 10 years
changed my
down the
name
line.
already.
Yes,
You
you're
know that,
brave.
so I
You're
I went
brave, you
into
see.
it thinking I was going to change my
Yeah,
name. So,
yeah. Yeah, you're a braver man than I am, you see.
well, you've been at it for a longer time. I have to admit, I feel I'm dealing with YouTube royalty a bit here because
Oh, I don't know about that.
I've been watching YouTube at probably 10 years at least, but you've been
Yeah.
around forever.
Yeah, I think I've not quite got my 10th anniversary yet. I think I'm about 9 years now. It's about this time, 2008,
Yeah,
when I
that's
took the plunge to start actually making videos.
and YouTube has gone through massive changes,
Huge changes. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and continues to change. And I'm wondering if we're going to lose kind of what we have going here. It's such an interesting thing to be able to do video responses, which is what the atheist community, I mean, that's really the bread and butter of the atheist community, right?
Yeah, we felt like we've lost it before in the past. Though. I mean, you remember watching videos that one of the functions that there used to be in the dim and distant past was that you could link a video response to a video. You had in between the
I
comment
remember
section and the
that. I
video,
remember
there was
that.
a little bar. Yeah, and that was really key for people building their channels up and responding to other videos, and that was kind of seen as a really big loss in the time. And I suppose life's carried on, hasn't it? And YouTube's carried on, and people have just found different mechanisms for broadcasting their responses.
Yeah, you can do that. You can actually add a link. You basically put a link in the comments and they can approve the link and the link is there, but it's not the same thing. It's definitely
It's
not
no,
the
it's,
same thing.
it
Yeah.
isn't. It tends to get buried, and some people just leave it in their spam bin. You
Yeah.
know, and that's a problem. The whole spam thing, I think, is an absolute nightmare. To be
Yeah,
fair.
yeah, exactly. So you saw the last Jordan, you watched the last Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris podcast, correct? There was actually two. There was a first one that kind of got mired in a discussion over the definition of truth, which is weird. Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson talking for two
Yeah.
hours about the definition of truth. I don't think you didn't see that one, right? You
Well,
just
I watched the second. You'd mentioned the podcasts to me, so I watched the second one, and they actually put me off watching the first one. They weren't very polite about their own podcast, to be fair. So I thought, well, if they're criticizing it so heavily, because it's quite an investment of time to watch podcasts and things of
it
that
is,
nature.
it is, yeah.
So I thought, okay, maybe I'll just stick with this second one, which was quite interesting. I enjoyed the second one actually. There's quite a number of interesting sort of points.
Well, before we talk about that, while I have you on the line, I want to ask you a question about Kristi Winters.
Okay.
Do you did a number of response videos to Kristi Winters? Have you had any response from her on your responses to her? Have you had any like first or face-to-face interactions? I guess it's not face-to-face over the internet, but any Twitter PMs or anything?
We've shared. Right. I follow Kristi on Twitter. Kristi follows me on Twitter. We've had the occasional private message, generally regarding things that aren't related to that. but are of perhaps of common interest. So, for example, when the Philip Moriarty thing blew up, we exchanged a couple of messages related to that. We suspended the hostilities for a couple of hours. Yeah, for a couple of hours. But that's about it. There's not a lot of love lost really between the two of us, to be fair.
The reason why that I bring it up was another thing that you wanted to talk about later on. Was I did a stream with Owen McDonald about a robust feminist argument kind of discussion.
Yes.
And Kristi Winters was really the inspiration for me to do that, because I am interested. I consider myself a pseudo intellectual academic. Like, I'm constantly reading, and I'm interested in feminism from an academic point of view. And Kristi Winters is kind of the go-to face of that here on YouTube. But I've had no luck interacting with her. Other than some kind of, she's pretty bad about hurling insults in the comment section. I've seen her hurling insults at you and other people. She's hurled some insults my way as well. So
yeah, I mean, she some of the ways that manifests becomes very strange at times. I mean, there was while we're on the subject of that, there was what had initially kicked off with Christy and I was this business of this video I'd made about rape culture and whether the United Kingdom and the United States are well described as rape cultures, and she objected to that and said she was going to peer review it, and the peer review of it took the form of a hangout, which was somewhat bizarre, with her two experts, one of which was demotivator opinion. I was expecting, because like she has links to academia, so I was expecting like she was going to be, this is a professor of rape culture studies from Oxford University or something, and then she introduces Foxy Jezebel and demotivator opinion as her experts, because she claims she didn't have the expertise herself. And then immediately Tim, demotivator opinion, says, well, actually, I'm not an expert, but I've read a book on it. But then she starts telling me how I should shut up and just listen to her because she's the expert on this subject. Well, she couldn't even decide whether she was an expert on the subject or whether Foxy Jezebel and demotivator opinion had such greater levels of expertise than her that she needed them on this hangout. It was a bit of a mess, to be fair, and I was expecting so much more. I was expecting a robust response, actually. You know, I'd sort of girded myself for the response, and it was such a she made such a shit job of it that it just left herself open to be torn to pieces, which is what I attempted to do, to dismantle. I did a two-part response, dismantled what she'd done and picked on some terrible oversights she'd done, such as making a video. She'd made a video on rape culture herself, and she'd claimed to quote from these sources, right? So you think these are proper sources. Shana Alfman was one of them who writes a lot on this subject, and she took a definition from that. She said she hadn't. When I went to the sources, what they'd written down as their definition was something totally different. What she'd done is she'd gone to the Wikipedia page, copy pasted the Wikipedia definition, and then just listed the Wikipedia references and assumed that those references used exactly the same wording. So she'd made it sound like she was familiar with these sources. She was familiar with the Wikipedia page on rape culture and nothing more. So I did a first video doing that, and then a second video actually tackling the complaint she'd made. But as a result of that, anyway, she claimed that she didn't watch either of my videos because she didn't have time to do that. But what she did have time to do was to go through every single comment that anybody had left and piece them all together and make a response video, not a response to the videos that I'd made, get this, but a response to the comments that people who had watched my video had left on her video. An attempt, it's like some kind of biblical analysis, you know. She tried to work it back and to work through what I must have said in my video to cause these people to have left these specific comments. It was absolutely bizarre, but it got even more bizarre because she got into a mode then in the comments response. People were saying, well, he hasn't said this, and you really maybe ought to go and watch his video. And she just started copy pasting about 3 or 4 different phrases, you know, and it sounded like somebody who was perhaps losing it a little bit at the time. I'm not suggesting she was, but that's what it sounded like. It actually sounded a little bit disturbing to keep reading these same responses that she was leaving to people's comments on there, which bore no resemblance whatsoever to what they were saying to her.
Yeah.
You know,
have you read any of her academic papers? Have you?
She linked me to what she did was, it's quite interesting because she left a comment recently saying that nobody ever responds.
Recently? How recently?
Yeah, recently, yeah, a couple of weeks back on a.
So she's still watching your videos, or
no. Oh no, she doesn't watch my videos. No, this was a Captain. This was on neutral ground. This was a Captain Andy.
Okay.
Captain Andy had made a response to me, and she made a comment about how boring my videos were, and that nobody they don't respond to them because they just
lives in a fucking glass house when it comes
they're just too boring to watch through the whole video, you see, which is it's fine. I have no problem with that at all.
At least you're on camera. Hers are like the PowerPoint presentation.
Well, it's quite interesting. I showed my wife the comment and she laughed and she said, well, that's one person who's actually, she's got a grip on what you actually like. So she sided with Kristi.
Your wife sided with her?
Yeah, she did. But yeah, that was kind of interesting because one of the things about 6 months or 8 months that she'd linked me, she actually did her thesis that she'd done it was a long and dreary work, as they often are. I don't blame her for that.
Oh, I've read one of her papers. So
she serialized it onto YouTube videos, and it's like 5 half-an-hour long videos where she goes through a thesis. And like after 5 minutes, it was like, you know, I'd need to be paid really to keep watching this.
Yeah,
you know, it would have to be a piece of work at a decent pay rate to sit through all of this shit. And I'm not saying it was crap. The thing is that what makes a good thesis, right?
No, it is crap. You had it right.
Yeah, it doesn't make a good video, and what makes a good video wouldn't obviously make a good thesis or dissertation.
You got to spice it up. One of the things that bugs me about Kristi Winters is I'm totally into the social sciences, and I love evolutionary psychology. She hates evolutionary psychology because it pretty much, you know, pokes holes in all of their feminist arguments.
Yeah.
But one of my heroes is Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you read Jonathan Haidt's work, but he often says that what we need is a reinvigoration of the social sciences, that we have global problems that need to be solved. And so like a concerted effort in the social sciences is the way to solve them, which I'm a firm believer in.
Yeah.
And with Kristi Winters running around telling everyone she's a social scientist and an academic, and her persona is kind of a crazy person, it really, you know, puts the idea that social scientists are crazy people into a lot of people's heads, I feel. So
it's a bit of a shame. If you look at some of the first videos she did when she started making a lot of videos on YouTube, they're actually quite interesting, some of her first videos. And she was doing videos on the patriarchy. And I didn't agree with everything she was saying, but they're actually, there were quite substantial videos. There were possibly, in these circles of YouTube, the best of type, I suppose, is what you would say. And it's kind of degenerated now to making a response to some tweet that Bearings made or something. You know, it's like you can't go around talking about robust feminist arguments when effectively that's what most of your output is. It's not looking for the most robust arguments that people are making against you. It's what's going to get you the most views. It's what's the most titillating. It's what has this large channel said that I can criticize simply because they're a large channel, not because what they're saying has any particular merit on this subject. You know, it's so hypocritical. I find that.
I actually made a video that was an excerpt from a Robert Wright book that I felt was some pretty compelling evidence for a patriarchy, and I shared it with her. And the fact that it was evolutionary psychology based argument, she just wanted to have nothing to do with it. And I thought, well, here's the evidence for the patriarchy that you're looking for. Why would you not embrace this? I thought patriarchy was your thing, because I think there is some evidence that, you know, division of labor, you know, that's the way we evolved as a sexually dimorphic species. And I mean, looking at it through an evolutionary psychology perspective, I think there is an argument to be made that we have some patriarchal tendencies as a species.
I think it's important, though, something that's not mentioned very often is that these disagreements, because they're very fundamental disagreements, that especially because in a lot of the arguments that are made, in fact, a lot of the arguments that the social justice crowd make actually rely upon innate components. And some of the discussions you got involved with Owen MacDonald, actually, some of the things that you could touch upon there and why feminism is needed can rely upon an innate component. If you didn't have it, it wouldn't necessarily be an issue.
But what exactly do you mean there? It's not.
I can give you an example of that in a minute. If you remind me of it, I'll give you an example of the kind of thing I mean in a minute. But so I think they're fundamental, intrinsic, and very closely related. But it tends to the discussion boils down to social science explanations, cultural explanations on one hand, and evolutionary psychology on another, without acknowledging that actually as well, evolutionary psychology is not the be all and end all. It's a very particular perspective on, I suppose, behavioral ecology and cognitive evolution, right? Mm-hmm. In that it takes those things and it goes further than that. It takes typically a domain-specific approach and then tries to weave a narrative as to why something evolved. But there's two very separate questions in evolutionary psychology and in evolutionary biology generally, which is, one, you've got the question of whether something is an adaptive trait. Has it evolved, right? And is it innate? Then you've got the question of why did it evolve? And what tends to happen in evolutionary psychology, from my perspective, is that they get muddled up in the way that people look at it. Is that they'll see somebody you'll take a paper and it'll try and demonstrate that a trait exists and that it has a biological basis, right? It has an innate basis and a genetic basis. But then tries to give a somewhat speculative, because it's necessarily somewhat speculative as it is across biology, as to what the selection pressures were that have led to that. Right now, the important thing is that second part might be true, but it could be an absolute load of junk. It could be absolute crap.
Because it's guesswork.
Yes, but it doesn't affect the first part, right? Even if your rationale that we've evolved, that it's because men who were poking woolly mammoths with spears and women were crushing berries in jars, that might be a load of bollocks. But the bit that's describing isn't necessarily a load of bollocks. Because it could still be an evolved trait. Yeah, exactly. And those two things need to be picked apart, I think. But it isn't. It tends to be the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. If you don't accept the explanation, then, well, it must be due to culture. Well, it doesn't follow that. It doesn't. It could still be an evolved trait. It could still be an innate, intrinsic trait, intrinsic differences. So yeah, that's something that I think isn't brought up often enough.
Jonathan Haidt talks about this in his book. There were several twin studies done at the turn of the millennium that these were basically biologically identical twins that were raised in different households.
Yeah.
And they had set the nature-nurture debate at about 70% biology and 30% culture, according to those studies, because they had twins that were like totally submerged in a liberal environment and turned out to be very conservative.
Yeah.
So the twins just turned out to be so similar personality wise and politically wise, where even if the environment was completely different, the biology completely took over. So I obviously these things are evolving and they're constantly, doing different studies and finding different things. For me, when I was a kid, it seemed like it was about 50-50. But since I read that, and the more that I read on it, the more I wonder just, in 10, 20 years, if we're going to be we think it's probably 95% biology and 5% culture.
Yeah, go on.
Culture can obviously do things, but I really think you're dealing with there are biological realities, and culture can push you one way or the other, but not a lot, I don't think so.
Yeah, I'm this was something actually I talked with, I don't know if you saw the hangout I did with Philip Moriarty, and this was something that I think I mentioned in the hangout with him, actually, or maybe I discussed it in email.
Is it still online, or is
it is? Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's on my channel.
Okay, I think I have actually listened to that one with you.
So I don't know. As like I said, I might be putting you on a bum steer there because maybe I didn't mention it on that hangout. But this was something that's always been a bit of a bone of contention with me, really. This business of putting a percentage on it, because I'll be honest, I don't find that a very meaningful way of looking at it.
Yeah,
because for me, the problem with a percentage is that it's not telling you very much. If you're talking in terms of heritability, then heritability is a relative measure of the difference that is the proportion of the difference that is attributable to genetics, let's say, in inheritance. Well, that depends upon two factors. It depends upon how much variation there is with regard to genetics, but it also depends upon how much variation there is within the culture generally, right? So it's not really telling you that much. So in the terms of those twin studies, the level of heritability isn't actually telling you what effect genes are having. It's a measure of the effect that genes are having, but it's also a measure of how diverse the parents were that those kids were put with.
Right.
Yeah. So if you put those kids with families, with sets of parents that are very, very culturally similar, then the heritability factor will go up to nearly 100%. If you put one of them with a set of Inuit parents and then another with a set of Booty warriors, it might shrink down to 10% or whatever.
That's the real test, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's a difficult. So that's one of the reasons I'm not too keen.
No one's going to do that test, Noel.
No, I don't,
that test is not going to take place.
Well, that's the problem with this whole field, is that all the experiments you need to do,
all the real interesting ones,
unethical. Yeah, we need them to be done. It's a shame all the Eastern Bloc countries don't exist anymore, because they do.
They would do it in a minute. Yeah. Have you read that? There was some Russian study where they tried to mate a chimpanzee and a woman.
Yes,
I was like, Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
That's the history of medicine, though, isn't it? Really,
give it to the Russians.
But the other thing is that it's the level of the behavior. I mean, the example that I've given on this before is it's like eating. How heritable is eating? How innate is the way that we eat? Well, in terms of using your hands rather than mashing your head into your food, it's probably 100%. But in terms of using a knife and fork rather than chopsticks, it's cultural. So,
or what you eat, or what you actually
the way that you eat.
No, I mean also the diet too, and the language is completely different.
So it's the level. It depends how far out you zoom as to how much of it's going to seem nature and how much of it's going to seem nurture, how much of it's innate and how much of it's cultural, I think.
So, but the interesting thing for politics and for religion, which I kind of think of politics and religion as kind of the same thing, is temperament makes a big part of it. Like they've figured out certain metrics tend to make you liberal and certain metrics tend to make you conservative. One of them is openness to experience. Liberals tend to be open to new experience, and conservatives tend to like, the familiar, which makes sense when you've got like the traditional versus the progress narratives. So if that temperament is driven by biology, that can shape a lot. And isn't part of our politics, part of our politics and part of our religion, the temperaments for that kind of shape how we interface with others in society, regardless of you can almost call the language someone speaks minutia, or the particular diet that they eat, minutia by comparison to like their political views.
Yeah, I think so, and I'm sure there are. But what a difficult thing to pick apart that is when you're looking at people's.
Yeah, but that's
politics.
why it's interesting.
Yeah, related to their parents' politics, and I'm quite sure. I mean, I'm sure a lot of my politics even now is shaped by, I suppose, the prejudices or the preconceptions that I've got
you're
from
lefty,
my past.
right?
It might be in American terms. I mean, I voted this last election. I voted for the Conservatives, so
Okay.
I voted for our right-wing party on the last election, but I've probably voted Labour as many times as I voted Conservative. So I am very, what I would say is, I in terms of social issues, I veer left. Economic issues, I veer right, I would say. Although there's always somebody who'd say, well, there's always somebody who'll say, well, you can't quite. Well, the word libertarian tends to be used in slightly different contexts on each side of the Atlantic. So it's not always it can be a bit of a dangerous word, you know, to use. But that's I'm socially liberal or socially left wing, I think, is the sort of description that people sometimes use for that. So
was there anything else that stood out in the Owen McDonald discussion that you wanted to comment on or set straight?
I mean, it was quite. It was. Let's think. The example, the main thing.
What worked about that? What was interesting for you?
What wasn't it? It was just. It was one of these. Actually, one of the things with Hangouts and podcasts is that they can end up either going down a very narrow line that isn't very interesting, or they become just a bit of a shit show, and it kind of didn't do either of those things. There's so many things that you both said that I thought, God, I wish I could have a little bit on this.
He did a decent job, I thought.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. He frustrated me. Let me say first off that I found him frustrating and slightly idealistic in the way that younger people often are, really. And he clearly, I would say that a lot of what he said with good intentions, and a lot of what he refused to say was, I think, underpinned by good intentions, but frustratingly so. I mean, one of the things that you asked him about was this thing with regard to single parents, right? And would he accept that, everything else being equal, this is what you're asking him, tell me if I'm misquoting you, but everything else being equal, you're better off to have two functional parents, generally a mother and a father, than to just have one parent. And I mean, he squirmed and writhed and wriggled on that one. The
answer is yes on that one, right? I mean, it's a pretty easy question.
Of course it's an easy question. And it's I mean, the whole business, unless you dispute the whole business of sexual selection, women have evolved. This is the one thing that most people, even people who don't buy most behavioral ecology as it relates to humans and evolutionary psychology, do buy this idea that women are more selective because they invest more, both before the baby's born and after the baby's born. And that is something that you cannot get around. You are a life support system for several years for that baby, and there's no way around that. So the investment is huge on the part of a mother. It isn't necessarily anything like as large on the part of a father, and that's part of the business of sexual selection. And so
women paternity uncertainty.
Yeah, of course, yes. And so, women innately understand that a child is better off having a father. That's why they invest so much in being so choosy. And we know, I mean, I've always understood it, but now having had a little boy who's now is 2 years and 3 months tomorrow, right? The difference that it makes, it's so difficult trying to correlate to sort of judge our lives so that I'm available, my wife's available, and we can put things together and we can both fit in. And we've said to each other, if there was just one of us, I mean, you'd do the best that you could, right? We're both committed parents, but how much harder that would be, and how much less we would be able, however much in our hearts we wanted to give the same to our little boy, he would suffer as a result of that. But what I felt with Owen was, and I probably won't watch this, but it's a shame in as much as I'd like him to dwell on this, is that what he said on that part of the video, he obviously said it with good intention, right? Because he doesn't want to say anything that could be seen negative as to presumably what he sees as an underprivileged group, and they are really, which is single parents. So he didn't want to down them in any way. Not that I regard that really as downing them, just to say you know, you can't be as efficient. It's not downing a football team to say that if you're a man down, if you've had somebody sent off, you're going to be up against it for the rest of the game. It's just the practical brute realities of it. But in doing so, I think he actually said something that I found more abhorrence, maybe a bit much. But what the point is that at the end of the day, the vast majority of single parents are mothers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And overwhelmingly so for a whole slew of reasons.
You have one kid. Some of these women have 3 kids.
Exactly, right? And the vast majority of the times it's the mother. If what Owen is saying is true, that he cannot discern any difference between just a mother and an active, interested father, then effectively what he's saying is that the average father is, to all intents and purposes, worthless. That it adds nothing. It's adding absolutely nothing. There's no you can't differentiate between a mother bringing a child up on her own and the father being involved in their children. What is that saying about how he regards fatherhood? And I don't believe he actually does. I think if you put it to him, he'd say, well, no, I'm not saying that. But it's an inevitable conclusion.
It is.
From what he's saying. You know? So I don't know. Maybe that's something that he needs to rethink there, especially in a situation where, as a society, one thing we would like to do is to get fathers more invested in their children.
Oh, yeah. Obama talked about it all the time. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's a difficult thing to do, I think.
Yeah, it is. It is. I just did a stream on paternity fraud and paternity uncertainty, and I feel like that's a huge issue that's going on. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's an interesting problem. Paternity uncertainty is why we're less as men, why they're less inclined to invest, because there always is that uncertainty that the child is actually theirs. So I'm not sure if you listen to that stream.
No, I haven't, but I'm familiar with that argument, and I think it's absolutely true. I've no dispute with that at all. But yeah, go on.
I'm pushing. I would push for widespread at birth paternity testing, and for me, one of the things that feminists are always saying is feminism is about equality between men and women. Yeah. The biggest inequality, I think, is they always have maternity certainty, and men don't have that same certainty, but we have the technology to fix that immediately. This is quite tangible. Easily, yeah, this is some tangible thing. And as a guys would never push for a paternity test, because the woman would immediately say, what, you don't trust me, right? Like asking for a paternity test could cause as many problems as if the paternity test came back, negative, or said that you weren't the father. But if the state just stepped in and did it, then it would take all of that, conflict out of that situation, because it would just be, the man would never have to ask for it, and every child would know who their biological father was. And I think it could change things in the realm of domestic violence. And
what I would say from that is that to do that, I mean, you're looking at that from the perspective of fathers and individuals, but from the perspective of a government, because things have to work from the perspective of a government, really, for there to be the impetus most of the time. And it's probably opening up a can of worms that they'd rather not open up. It might actually cause them more trouble than it gains them. And I'm afraid that's where a lot of things which actually make some sense. And in terms of the sort of ethics of mandating a test like that, when we had our discussions with the doctors in the run-up to my wife giving birth, they took her to one side and asked her if there's any domestic abuse in the household, and a whole series of questions like that. Now that wasn't because of anything specific with us. Those are questions that now they ask everybody, and they do it on a proactive basis, so it takes away the responsibility of a woman doing it on her own accord, right? So nothing can be thrown back in anybody's face.
Right.
So I understand that, but that is the same kind of logic as conducting a test like that.
Sure.
The state's mandating it because otherwise, as you say, it puts you in a difficult cultural position. Whereas if a man says, well, I want to check, effectively you are, then you're questioning somebody's honesty or their fidelity.
Right.
And it's taking that out the mix, isn't it? It's like, well, I'm sorry, you know, everybody does this test.
They do something. You have universal healthcare over there. We don't have universal healthcare here, but I've seen. I'm not sure if it's in the UK or if it's in France, but at the end of life, a lot of times the doctors in European countries step in, where in America it's very much the family has to make the decision whether or not you're going to unplug granddad, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that, you know, how can you ask the family to make that decision?
Yeah.
Like, it's almost better that that society steps in, is the way that I look at it, because it really is more helpful. And
well,
this paternity thing, I see kind of the same way, as like, it's more helpful if society steps in, because the father never wants to say anything, but you're really, I don't know if you've checked into it, but there's some really interesting videos on YouTube about paternity fraud, and you're really building, you know, a family on a foundation of sand. If the mother's screwing around and you're bringing kids into that situation, and it's brutal for the kids. It's just
of course it is, and it's brutal for the father if he finds out down the line, because he's built a relationship and built love, but at the same time that is underpinned. It's a little bit, I suppose, like women who fall pregnant as a result of being raped. That they have a child at the end result. If they're not allowed to have an abortion, they would like to have an abortion. They've got a child at the end, and they may still love that child, but there's still going to be a sense of resentment that underpins it, you know. Yeah. And it's the same kind of thing there. You're putting somebody in a position where they're going to have very dissonant views on something, a situation that seemed very simple has been allowed to develop into an entirely different situation, with some very, very difficult views that are feelings that are going to be tough to deal with. But the interesting thing for me with regard to that, as you say, there's that kind of underpinning to all of it, but there's also a very, very strong cultural aspect with regard to how we treat fathers that I think stops fathers investing more. And I liken it to something that I had a talk from a social worker a few years ago with regard to houses that we go in at work, right, and things to look out for. And one of the points that was made that was with regard to mothers. And what she'd said was that often mothers who think their children are going to go into care, okay, that there's some pressure from social services that the child may be going into care because they're not doing a good enough job, start to detach from their children, and put a little bit of emotional distance between them. And it's understandable why you would do that. It's the same as people that, you know, don't want to fall in love because they don't want to risk it all going wrong. If you feel there's a chance that relationship can be jeopardized, it's constantly in jeopardy, you're not as willing to invest as much. And it made me think, when sometime down the line, when from having that talk, was that's the position that fathers are in nearly all the time. And especially if you get a typical relationship, perhaps with two 20-year-olds, where it's a little bit off and on, and she's fallen pregnant and he wants to do the right thing, but they have a relationship effectively where their little baby or their little toddler is hers unquestioningly, right? If they split up, the child either leaves with her or he leaves and the child stays with her. And so her relationship with that child is never in jeopardy. It's not contingent on anything, whereas his relationship with that child is entirely contingent on his relationship with the child's mother, and is potentially jeopardized whenever that other relationship is jeopardized. And so there is no way, if mothers were in the same position, I'm quite certain that even with the evolutionary differences that men and women have, and the innate differences men and women have towards children, that women would not be as emotionally attached if their relationships with their children were in as much jeopardy potentially as is the case with men.
Yeah, I
And that
think
is a societal thing, isn't it? That is something that actually we could go some way towards reshaping, I think.
Well, I think I would say it's the biology thing. I'd say the reason why women are more invested in the child is they know that the child is actually theirs. And if the couple, the 20-something couple, is on again and off again, I mean, paternity uncertainty is probably there. And if a man is stepping out of the situation, it's probably easier for him to say, well, maybe it's not even my kid. I don't know for sure. The thing that I'm proposing is society would step in and do the paperwork and say,
Yeah,
yes, that's definitely your kid.
I think that would help. I mean, it would help.
Yeah, it might change things, right?
It might help, but as I said, I don't think that would go all the way, because you've still got the situation where there's a permanent shadow hanging over your relationship with your child, which is that your child could be taken away, effectively taken away from you at any time. So you're going to insulate yourself a little bit.
And the women do it, and they have certainty already. You're saying they detach a little if they know social services is
exactly. If they put in the same situation where the child could be taken away from them, they start doing the same kind of thing that fathers tend to do, because they're shielding themselves. Same as if you've got a relative that you know is terminally ill, you're preparing yourself and perhaps emotionally detaching a bit already, because you know that there's this threat hanging over your head that they could die, at any stage.
So the thrust of that hangout was that feminism is responsible for all this bullshit.
Yeah, well, the argument that you got into with him, you wanted his response there because there was this business. The bit that I didn't agree with you on that, which I found
what?
Yeah, I know. It's hard to believe.
Bullshit. All right, thanks. That was a great hangout.
What you seem to be saying at that point was that female infidelity is more of an issue than male infidelity in terms of the structure of society. And I didn't really buy that from what you said. I mean, you talked about the guy, you said you'll see, because you were talking about paternity uncertainty, and you said the kind of guy you'll see on one of these sort of Jerry Springer shows, or the what's the guy called in the UK? I've forgotten his name. We have a similar kind of chap in the UK now.
You have a Maury Povich over there, so you guys have paternity uncertainty then as well.
Yeah, well, we have the same kind of. We have this terrible Jeremy Kyle. The guy's called Jeremy.
If they have enough to do a show.
Yeah, well, it's not just paternity uncertainty. They have all kinds of. I mean, it's an absolute mess. The people that are on his show,
right? Totally.
You've got to be a mess to want to be on his show, really. But the kind of people that are on the show where it's like, am I the father? When you were mentioning that, I was immediately thinking, yeah, I know the kind of guy. He's on the show, and Jeremy Kyle would say to him, okay, is this your only child? And he'd say, oh no, I've got 8 children by eight different mothers.
Right.
And I thought, so how is that not detrimental to society in exactly the same way? In fact, in some ways, it's worse, because a man can do more damage. At the very least, a woman can only have one baby at once by one father at once, whereas a man can. So the kind of societal, or in terms of welfare and social services, so devastation in a short period of time.
The idea behind the paternity testing. Well, my thinking is, if he's on the show, he doesn't know that it's his kid, right? So we know that those 8 kids are his, but he's tacitly like they're all maybe 30% his, right, in his mind.
Yeah.
So my thinking is with the paternity testing, when the first one comes along, he knows, okay, that one's mine, right?
Yeah.
So maybe he invests a little more instead of going out and trying to father other children. So
yeah. No, I get that.
I'm with you.
No, I get the paternity testing, but you was talking about Owen and saying that it was like there was more of a societal cost to promiscuity when women are promiscuous than when men are promiscuous. Right. And you talked about this world where all women are porn stars, which immediately seemed quite an appealing. It seemed quite an appealing thought for about 10 seconds, and then I imagined all this kind of alternative, I don't know, what would you say, not traditionally beautiful pornography. I think the polite way you're supposed to say it nowadays. And I thought, no, maybe it wouldn't be quite the marvelous utopia that I was thinking. I mean, I was on a similar sort of plane to Owen with regard to that. You were saying, would you want a woman that's a porn star or something like my justifications would be slightly different to Owen's,
right.
it's more along the lines of you've got somebody that's going to do all the good stuff in the bedroom. You know, if of all the things that you can know about somebody in advance just by knowing their job,
Right.
that's one of the jobs where it's relevant. It's
I
relevant
gotcha.
to the relationship. I'm not really interested in whether you're a good singer or whether you're good at doing the accounts. But
so that kind of stuff doesn't bother you then?
It doesn't really bother me at all.
Yeah, okay. There are guys that it doesn't bother.
Yeah,
I'm more the jealous type.
Of course. Yeah.
I'm more the jealous type, and
Yeah.
I've just been calibrated that way. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you how do you turn off jealousy or turn it down, or I mean, how do you turn off or any of those kind of like raw emotions, right?
I don't know, but I thought that you're right that there are some people that it wouldn't work for, but your argument seemed to be a whole series of absolutes. For start, it was a what if everybody did this? You know, what if every woman was a butcher? Vegan men are going to have nobody that they can marry. Well, not every woman is going to be a butcher.
Oh,
and,
totally.
And so you've got that. And then there was also this thing on top that, well, if a man doesn't marry, that he's going to keep going around stealing cars and beating people up. And I think that, again, is an absolute argument. I do believe what you said is right, that marriage has a calming influence on men. Yeah. But I think it's not quite as simple as that. I think it probably does. But also, men tend to get married as they're calming down. And of course, if you look at married men and unmarried men, the older you are, the more likely you are to be married. So part of the reason that married men are perhaps a little bit more moderate in their behavior is simply because they're older. They're 30 years old, 40 years old, and not 18, 20 years old. You know, so I don't know whether you'd have all these 40-year-old men acting like 18-year-olds because there's no virgins for them to marry, you know.
It's a valid point.
I mean, I've gone over the top a bit there. I'm batting one back at you there, aren't I?
No. I've gone to the extreme
there, but
the thing is, it's those 20s, because men in their 20s tend to be more violent, you know, more volatile. Back when society was, you know, you marry your high school sweetheart, you know, and start a family. If you start a family in your 20s, we have the advantage of taking the fight out of the, you know, civilizing those men in their 20s, right? In their 30s and 40s, you make a very valid argument. I mean, what the hell are we doing? They've already passed that stage in life, and it's just our society is kind of evolved where people are getting married later and later. They are going out and, you know, sowing their wild oats at 20 and then getting married in their 30s. Yeah. So
and don't you think as well, right? This is that, you know, I mean, I take on board that we can have innate predispositions towards certain things and favor certain things, but it sometimes the thing that we favor, the link is somewhat, it's not direct. And so attitudes, you can still have that innate component, but you can still, your understanding of the situation can alter it. That maybe doesn't come across very clearly. Let me give you an example of the kind of thing that I mean, right? So we have an understanding that, pardon me, I've just burped. I don't know if that came across on the microphone. So we have an understanding to do with beauty and what men find beautiful and desirable in women. And there are certain things that seem to cross cultures, like symmetry, like a certain golden ratio of hip to waist, etc., etc. But we also know that over the years that our beauty standards have changed, and that it's more slender women that are seen as more beautiful now than before. And you're going back to the same kind of arguments that you get with either the social sciences or evolutionary psychology, where they're the facts, and then we try and weave a narrative to understand that. The narrative we weave, of course, is that when food was scarcer, that was a sign that you're well nourished, and now, you know, anybody can afford to be fat. So it's not really much of a sign of health anymore. It's usually an indicator of the opposite.
Right.
So what I would say with regard to that is that perhaps there is an innate component there, right? But the innate drive isn't towards a particular body size. It's towards health, we're attracted to people that we regard as healthy. So that's the innate component, the innate module. But then the learned module is what is healthy. So that bit can alter. We can grow up and understand that actually this body shape is healthy, and this sort of and connotes a certain lifestyle or whatever, and this body shape more often statistically connotes these other things. So there is some flexibility there, and maybe the same kind of flexibility exists with regard to how tolerant we are of how many sexual partners, because maybe there is an innate component there, and you're right about that. But maybe it isn't directly linked to numbers of sexual partners. It's directly linked to some other factors. And the fact that we know about contraception, and the fact that we know about various other things, safe sex and all these kinds of things, and that we can tease apart reproduction from our attitudes towards sex as pleasure, means that perhaps it's not cut and dried, that people will just... that there's a factor that we can't, a hurdle that's insurmountable, and that people's actual, when you hear somebody like Owen MacDonald as a younger person say, no, it just doesn't bother me, perhaps if he was born 20 or 30 years ago, it would have bothered him. He would have it would have bothered, and because maybe that learned component can change, even if there is.
Sure. You grew up and your dad's constantly saying, pointing out scantily clad women as slut, floozy, right? So that could be a huge part of it. So do you have anything you want to say in closing on the robust feminist argument? And we'll talk. I
haven't given you one, have I? Really, I suppose I should have really given you a reasonably robust.
I don't. What do you mean? So you're in this fight, aren't you? I mean, one of the things I said to Owen was, I feel like I'm the only one looking for a robust feminist argument. I haven't found it. I haven't seen it yet. So
no, well, when you said that, I was kind of putting my hand up as I'm listening to the video and thinking, you wanker. What about I am as well.
But are you a feminist argument or an anti-feminist argument?
I'm not. No. Well, I don't describe myself as either, really. I think the problem with labels like feminist,
then how are you putting up an argument?
Well, no. We can still put up an argument. I think there's some, the problem with feminism is that it's such a wide gamut of different positions to begin with. Not just, never mind getting to the positions. It's a goal. It's an ideology. It's a movement. It's an academic discipline. Within that academic, it's a way of carrying out.
It's a clan.
It's just, there's so many different things, and then there's so many different positions within it, and they all hate one another. But what is it? If I tell you I'm a feminist, right? That ought to give you some information about me, and yet it doesn't really tell you anything other than that I'm the kind of person who calls themselves a feminist, right? That's, you can actually get more from that than you do from the word itself. So it's practically useless. And if the word feminist is useless, for my money, anti-feminist is useless. I mean, you look on, I think it's the Wikipedia definition of anti-feminist. It says something like an anti-feminist is somebody who disagrees with at least some forms of feminism. Well, that means that every feminist is an anti-feminist, doesn't it? Kevin Logan's an anti-feminist, and Kristi Winters is an anti-feminist. So I find them really, really unhelpful, and sure, if you and people will always back at you that which doesn't really apply. So if you say, no, I'm not a feminist, then the answer is, so you don't believe that women should be treated equally and according to their merits and all this individual merits. Well, of course I do, right? But then if you say, okay, so I am a feminist, then they start assuming a lot of things that you accept, that we live in a patriarchy, etc., etc., and that we live in a rape culture and all these different things, which you don't. You don't accept. So it's a kind of label which I'm sort of say, well, if you want to call me, I'll tell you what I think, and if you want to say I'm a feminist, then that's fine. By your definition, I am. If you want to say I'm not, then the same is true. But I am interested in what are the stronger points, and is there is there some benefit to feminism?
What is the
is.
stronger point?
I think there is. Well, and something that I've said as well before is that I actually think that men's rights movements could learn a lot more by emulating some of the things that feminists do well and that they don't do so well. Well, like for one of the examples of something where I think that we still haven't quite solved, in terms of the wage gaps. I mean, you could spend hours just talking about the wage gap, of course, and it's so misportrayed and mangled this way and that way. But one of the things that's often brought up is this business that different jobs, right? And this goes back as well to this thing that I was saying before about evo psych and things like that, and cognitive behavioral ecology triggering into the social factors, is that this idea that different jobs pay different amounts and different fields pay different amounts, and that men go into the fields that pay well and women go into fields that don't pay so well, which is true, but that's only half. You've only gone halfway there, because to just leave it at that assumes something, which I mentioned this in a video once before, and I said it's like each side is using half their own argument and half the other side's, because if only it was as easy as that, right? If you believe in the tabula rasa, the blank slate, whatever, then that's ever so easy, isn't it? Women can just all become engineers, and which might pay more.
You don't believe in the blank slate, do you?
No, I don't at all.
Yeah.
No, it's
pretty debunked,
right? But if you do believe in that, then these different differentials shouldn't be a problem, because women can just move into fields that pay more, and men would be moving into fields that don't pay as well. It would all just balance itself out. The fact that it doesn't is the issue, and part of the fact that it doesn't, I think, is because statistically, I'm not talking about individuals, but statistically, I think men are drawn to other things than women, and we know that from looking at the toy choices that kids play with, and other
monkeys make.
Exactly. we have these things, and it's stark how similar other primates are. And we also know actually that women are a bit more versatile than men are in these regards. So some of these things could be more of an issue for men than for women. But this is why I say it's like each side's using the other side's argument. If we're as flexible and it's all culture, then this shouldn't be an argument for the SJW side. And yet it's the sort of anti-SJW side that are saying, well, women can just do all the better paying jobs, when they are the ones, and I count myself as part of that side, who at the same time will say men and women have these intrinsic differences. Well, if you believe they've got those intrinsic differences, it's not so easy for men and women en masse to start switching to other occupations. And part of the problem is this, right? If it was all just down, if occupations all paid purely on the basis of worth, of productivity, of how much value you bring to your company, how much money you make, etc., how scarce your skill is, I wouldn't have a problem. But I don't believe that is the case. Obviously, if you go back historically, obviously you go back to like the Industrial Revolution and the mills in Manchester, the cotton mills in Manchester, etc., you had men's jobs and women's jobs, and men's jobs paid more because they were men's jobs. And some jobs were kept for men, even if women could do them. There was a strong union commitment that they were men's jobs because, well,
they got to raise a family.
If women started doing the job, the pay rate would go down because it would be women's work, right? And you only have to go back 2 or 3 decades, and there was a lot of that in the UK. That very similar jobs would pay very different amounts because men were doing them or women were doing them. Often, seemingly, the only justification was historical pay rates. And in terms of the public sector, often those historical pay rates would actually be hardwired in, so that everybody stayed on the same. All those jobs would be paid relative to one another, and so as when you got your increment, which in the 60s would be quite high because of inflation and the general mismanagement of the economy, you'd be getting 10% pay raise, but everybody got the same one. So that inequality remained in the system. And as I say, it wasn't because the man's job was more important. It was simply because of historical factors. Now, I think a lot of that has gone.
Okay, there's the important part.
I'm seriously not convinced that it's all gone.
Okay.
Right? I'm seriously convinced. I'm convinced that there are still jobs out there. And this is something that's in UK law now, which is that you can have these job sizing evaluations.
Well, there's an argument too that you're not making. That's a lot of women go into teaching, and I think teaching is dramatically underpaid. And I think one of the reasons why it might be dramatically underpaid is that historically it was considered women's work, and just those historical holdovers are still there. I think so. And I think something when I was in the sixth form, this will interest you with regard to that. I'm sounding a bit like Jordan Peterson, aren't I, introducing it like that? But yeah, when I was in the sixth form, my physics teacher was in the National Union of Teachers, which was the most militant of the teaching unions. And they go on strike fairly readily compared to the other teaching unions in the UK. And he said to me privately, I was a sixth form sort of 16 to 18. So they not treating you like a kid anymore. They'll talk to you a bit more on a one-to-one basis. And I got on really well with him. And he said to me, the problem with teaching is that there are too many women in teaching for whom their income is their household's second income. So if they don't get a very good pay deal, gotcha.
It doesn't really matter. They don't have the same motivation that most of the men have, because for them that is the main wage. So they are prepared to walk out the door and say, you're taking the piss. Whereas for the women, they'll just sort of roll over and say, oh, well, I don't really want to strike because the kids' education will suffer. But they're not so bothered about it because their husband's earning 50% more. Yeah,
it's 100% economics.
That's probably changed a little bit now.
With all these single mothers, they're helping out.
Well, partly with that, partly changes to the workforce, and
that's funny.
Yeah, so that probably has changed to some extent. And of course, one of the biggest, if you look actually at the wage gap in the UK, the biggest difference that accounts for it is that more women do part-time work. And it's part-time work that pays less. And interestingly, if you wanted to, the best way, if you wanted to narrow that pay gap, the best way would be to try and coerce women who have had babies not to go back part-time. Although who's going to buy that as being a pro-woman thing to do? And yet actually that's what it mainly boils down to. It's women going back part-time, having had babies, and ending up doing work that doesn't pay so well. But it's that choice. That's the kind of choice that we're supposed to be enabling women, but perversely it has this effect on the wage gap. But that other example I gave you with different jobs, I that would be something for me which I think is something where feminism still has a role. To make sure that we should be picking apart those differentials that actually maybe need looking at and revisiting, and those that don't. The problem is that isn't what tends to happen. It tends to be these silly, irrelevant headline figures or these ridiculous issues that have very little bearing and are very much sort of market force driven. This product is a bit sexist, or it's a bit more aimed towards men because that's a product that men buy, or that's a product that women buy.
The sexism in advertising, not enough representation in positions of power.
Yeah, but it's all most of a lot of these things are market driven. You buy a magazine aimed at men, it's got a woman, it's got a pretty looking woman on the cover. You buy a magazine aimed at women, it's got a pretty looking woman on the cover. Now that's not because of some sexism against men. It's simply that the magazine makers know what sells when they put it on the cover.
Right.
And it's women want to buy a magazine with a woman on the cover, and men for different reasons, but.
This is something I just want to bring this up, and then we'll move on to Sam Harris, because I had made a response video to you about victimhood culture, and part of the thing for me is separating feminism into these two camps. Like the arguments that you're making, reasons why we need feminism, I think of as kind of the the measured response, like the vision of the world accurately, and some public policy change needs to be implemented here because women truly aren't getting a fair shake. And then there is this kind of toxic stew with this new victimhood culture that's evolving, where it increases somebody's status to be seen as a marginalized individual. And feminists a lot of times latch onto that, and they make women out to be marginalized because it increases their status. It gains them sympathy from, I don't know, their peer group, from some people, and that kind of feminism I see not being helpful, just kind of muddying the waters.
I'm sure it's not helpful, and I'm sure that most of the pushback against feminism is as a result of that. And it doesn't portray women in a very good light at all.
No, not
it
at
makes
all.
them look like little field mice that you know, women are the equal of men, but we've got to wrap them up in cotton wool, and you know, they can't speak for themselves and look after themselves, and
the mansplaining, the man spreading.
Yeah, and the way that we need to all, if you look at all the aspects of society where women need protection, and often in those same aspects of society, men, there's the issue with men as well, but it's, well, you know, bloody hell, they can look after themselves, can't they? If they don't like it, do something about it, sort of thing. It's like we're treating men as adults there, maybe sometimes being a bit callous as a result, you know, due to sort of societal attitudes towards men, but women were treating in a totally different way.
Is there a way to separate those two types of feminism, though?
I don't know that there is. Because
you have to judge people's
broad, like I said, it's such a broad church, isn't it? And people will always jump on. It's the same as you see with these the men's rights movement and men's rights advocates. There are some very legitimate issues, but at the same time, inevitably, misogynists will get attracted to that argument, just the same as misandrists will get attracted. If you don't like men, you're going to be attracted to feminism. You're going to find a niche in there, aren't you? And if you don't like women, you're going to get attracted to that. And so everything becomes poisoned by that. And I don't know how you pick it apart, really. It's almost as if the work you do in many ways needs to be done apart from it. So what I would say, you know, as a sort of, to advocate feminism for a moment, even though I'm not a feminist, is that
you're advocating the ones.
Yeah, I think there's a place for things that you would describe as feminism, because they're focused on women and women's issues, but it's not necessarily under this great big. It isn't necessarily done in the name of feminism. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be done by a feminist organization or a feminist movement, because as soon as you do that, you start attracting all these ne'er-do-wells that are just gonna, you know, fuck up anything that you actually try and do that needs doing, and start bringing up all these issues that really are either non-issues or just make you look petty. You make the whole endeavor look petty, you know?
Yes. I wonder how much of it is just like BuzzFeed is. They're a clickbait organization.
Yeah.
So I wonder how much of our culture is being dragged through the mud just so people can gain advertising dollars.
And it's, I think, not just YouTube, not just BuzzFeed, sorry, but the whole way in which everything works. People like Jessica Valenti and people like that, you know, Amanda Marcotte writing articles on these things. They know that if they do something controversial and outrageous, it gets them views, it gets their, people are clicking on their stuff, people are talking about them, they get invited to write more stuff, of course. And it's the same thing, let's be honest, on the other side, on YouTube.
Yeah,
right, it's the same thing as well. If you say something that's quite mundane, people might agree with you, but then they'll go and watch somebody shouting and saying something about what cunts everybody is, right? At the end of the day, that's what they'll go and do.
Or just saying stupid shit. Like if Riley Dennis says stupid shit every day and everyone just is drawn to that.
Exactly. Yeah. Or, you know, or just picking on the most petty things and saying, well, that's racist, that's sexist. And both sides are doing that kind of thing now. It happens all the time now. Everybody's looking. It's like you say, of course, because once you put a value on being oppressed, you can do it for all the right reasons, for the best reasons in the world, you know. But as soon as you put a value on something, you weaponize it, and somebody else is going to use it to their advantage. Of course they are, and unless you can take account of that, and it's not always that easy to do, it's going to be misused.
So are you a Sam Harris fan?
Am I a Sam Harris fan? Yeah, I think I'm generally a Sam Harris fan. I'm not somebody who, whenever I listen to him speak, I love the way that he speaks, and I love the way he's a very eloquent guy, but he distills things down really well. You know, he's the kind of guy. He makes an argument. And you sometimes think, do you know what? I wish I could have come out with that so well.
I wish
it's a bit like, yeah.
He had four words that I had to look up in that fucking podcast. And I was like, God, I could never use one of these words. I'd feel like a fraud.
Yeah. I mean, you can take that to an extreme. I don't know if you've ever read much by Stephen Jay Gould.
I've heard of him. I don't know that I've read it.
If you read it, I've got his book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. Huge. I mean, it's bigger than the Bible, this fucking book. It took him 20 years to complete. But it's written in such a way that it's like the whole book is written in a way as to show off how elaborate his vocabulary is. So every page you're looking up.
Is Sam Harris doing that?
I don't think he's as bad at no. Sam Harris is nowhere near Stephen Jay Gould level.
But is Sam Harris doing it to show off, or is he?
No, I don't think so. No, I think it's kind of relevant.
It's sincere.
Yeah, he'll stick with the same word. If you listen to Sam Harris, he'll keep using the same word, whereas Stephen Jay Gould will use 6 different words for the same thing. And some of them, nobody else may have used that word for 200 fucking years. You know, he's just sticking it in. It's like some twisted game. I think he's playing with some of the.
That's funny. So are you
now? So
are you a Jordan Peterson fan?
Do you know? I like. Again, there were some issues that I don't like Jordan Peterson about. And when there was all the big controversy, and he was giving, what he did was something that some of his opponents do, which is that they'll say something which is controversial as if it isn't, as if everybody agrees. It's widely known. Everybody accepts X. And you think, well, actually, they don't. And I think you're overstating the case with, you know, you're kind of 20% right or 30%.
Do you have an example of one?
I'm trying to think, because I'm thinking back. That was obviously a few months ago when that all come up. But he was talking about some of the innate characteristics and differences between men and women, and he made it very, very black and white, very, very clear cut. And I thought, whoa, some people don't accept that at all, but most people involved in those fields who are open-minded believe that this is a balance of things, whereas he's suggesting as if it's like almost like a kind of genetic determinism rather than a case of us having predispositions.
Yeah, he's very matter of fact on the biological sex thing.
Yeah, he is. I think he goes too far with that. What I like about him is there's a kind of brutal frankness that I've in some cases I've never heard anywhere else. Like, he did it at the start of that podcast, and I've seen him do it several times before, where he talks about debates or discussions he's had, the kind of things that, you know, we might end this hangout, right, and we'll go away and make a cup of coffee or something and think, I wish I'd said that, or I handled that badly, or I didn't use the right tactic with that. He says that, right? He comes out, it's like
he goes to his YouTube page and he's totally like, honest about it.
It's like, yeah, I used the wrong tactic there. Or I'd use.
If I catch you crying on camera after this,
yeah, I kind of admire that. It's kind of refreshing to see. You know, it's a little bit disconcerting because it's pulling the curtain to one side in a way. You know, as to how debates actually function.
So Jordan Peterson is a mixed bag for me, because I love him on the transgender thing and the biological sex thing, and the freedom of speech thing. I love him on that. But I hated him on that second Sam Harris podcast, because I have an interesting perspective on religion. And your channel is a very much an atheist channel, right? You started as an atheist channel.
Started exclusively,
yeah. So 99% of your content is atheist. I myself am an atheist, and I was right there. I was listening to your content back when you started, and I was loving the battle between the atheists and the Christians. But now that I've read more, I honestly feel like economists call it social capital. And I don't know if you've read the book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. No. But he makes a pretty compelling argument that modern society is losing a lot of social capital as secular institutions take over for religious institutions. And I kind of feel like there is this social capital is necessary in society, and I'm totally on board with moving more towards an atheistic society. Religion doesn't drive me, but at the same time, we need some secular institution to kind of fill the vacuum of religion. So I'm sympathetic to the argument that Jordan is making, but Jordan is just saying we need to go back to religion. And Sam Harris is saying we need to get rid of religion, but he does make the caveat that, you know, there is something to mystical experience. And he wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, where, you know, he's basically saying, you know, science can fill this void. Like, he acknowledges that the void is there. And I think one of the reasons why people really wanted them to have a discussion, and they came together to do one discussion that kind of got derailed, and then this was the second discussion, was to try to hammer out some kind of interface here for an institution that would be, you know, a secular type institution that would be taking the place of religion in creating social capital in society. And they never really talked about any of that stuff. So I'm thinking that we need that. A lot of people aren't thinking that we need that. And I think really the next big conversation for the atheist community is, first of all, we have to get everyone on the same page that we actually need that kind of thing, which is a tall order. I don't even know if that can be done. And once that is agreed upon socially by society, then we need to start hammering out, well, what is that institution going to look like? So I know these are really out there ideas, but I mean, that's what we're here to do, right? Talk about really out there ideas.
This is the second half of the discussion that they'd had on the second podcast, really, wasn't it? When it moved on to,
but they didn't really cover any of the stuff that I'm talking about.
No.
What was your take of that? The second discussion.
The second, right? Well, the talk about the second half of the second discussion with relationships, because this was the bit where you're talking about with regards to Jordan Peterson and this idea that he can see some merit and some worth in these religious stories, effectively as stories. Well, it wasn't entirely clear that it seemed to me as if he's putting the cart before the horse to some extent, because of course he's choosing the stories and his interpretations of different parts of scripture, but to fulfill the purpose. It's like, this is what I believe morally, and so what can I find that I can engineer to make that case? Well, it's not really doing a great. I suppose you could say maybe you could then use that to pass it on to somebody else, rather than having to do the sort of heavy lifting of the thinking that he's done. But it's not underpinning it, is it? He's almost suggesting that we're learning something from it. Well, you're not. You're encoding your morality in that story. You're not getting morality from that story. So it wasn't entirely clear. And I know that Sam Harris picked him up quite early in the podcast. I was pleased he did, because I was having the same objection at the same time, which was that it was entirely unclear from what Peterson was saying whether his thoughts on morality were descriptive or normative. He seemed to flip between the two, or not really be clear which.
Can you tell our audience what descriptive and normative is? Just because I know people.
Yeah. So descriptive morality is going out there and saying, what morals do people have, and why do they have them? You're
just describing them.
Like an historian or an archaeologist or something. You're going out there, and describing them. Whereas a normative argument, that's how we ought to behave. That's sort of looking forwards. Have we got a meta-ethical theory that we can underpin morality
that says this is the right thing to do?
Yeah, and of course that's something that Sam Harris is for me. Is, as I understand his approach, it kind of falls flat for me, really, in some ways, for a number of reasons. But that's something that he's very invested in. So I could understand.
Sam Harris wants to come up with a scientific way to come up with normative claims.
I mean, I don't think that's going to work, and I don't.
No, me neither.
It's kind of an odd thing, unless you want to create a machine that will give you 100 million moral judgments a minute, because ultimately, whatever it is that you're examining, you have to have some datum points to see whether it's working or not to begin with. You know,
well, before you can do that, you have to pick your yardstick, right? I mean, what
you do. Well, that's what I mean by these data. That's what I mean by
Yeah.
these data. Yeah, these.
So
data
are we going to do it
points,
by human happiness? Or are we going to do it by number of offspring?
The first thing, it seems to me that if he came up with, let's say he came up, let's function it as an algorithm. Let's say he could come up with some kind of algorithm for morality. How would you judge whether that algorithm was any good or not? You would actually judge it by how we felt about. Would you chuck some things in there?
Wouldn't it be totally subjective? Yeah.
See what it come up with, and if you thought, well, that's a load of bollocks, that's not moral. So ultimately, you're referring back to our human judgment. So if you can't really get, if ultimately that is your datum, why try and replace that human judgment? Why not just keep doing what we do, which is to go through the process of the human judgments and the interactions, the contractarian interactions we have in society now? Because you're going to end up going back to that to see whether your scientific approach is working.
See, we know now though where the human judgment comes from, and I think that is interesting. The human, this is my opinion. There's been lots of studies on this. I don't have them on hand, and I don't know your feeling about it. But I mean, the way to act, the morality that we share as human beings evolves from the decisions of us as individuals. But the judgment that you're talking about is that gut level response on, is this right to do or is this wrong to do? And that gut level response, this is why I love evolutionary psychology, is because that gut level response evolved in human beings. And it's kind of, emotion is really a bad word for it. It's really an intuition, because, if a man had the intuition to get jealous and, guard his mate, then if that was good for his genes, he passed that intuition or emotion down to his offspring. And that intuition spread throughout the ages. So these gut level responses that people have, whether something is right or wrong, is really, really linked to evolution and kind of a predictive quality of what is good for our genes. But the question that I have is, can we base our morality on that yardstick?
Well, I think the important thing, because I agree with everything that you say there, but the important thing, and one of the problems with discussions of moral philosophy, as I see it, is that most of it is formulated in eras before we even had that understanding of our evolutionary heritage.
Totally,
right?
Yeah.
So the basic thought of what do we mean? The first question you've got to ask is, what do we mean by morality? And I think discussions, even like the discussion that we're discussing here between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, they get off to a bad footing because they do something which, for me, is a fundamental misunderstanding of what morality is, because they center morality on the individual. And so my morality, according to the way that most of these discussions function, my morality is about my behavior. It's about modifying and limiting my own behavior. But I don't believe that is why we evolved morality. That isn't what the business of morality itself. We like every creature that's ever evolved, if we have a way of shaping our environment or controlling our environment, whether it's building a little house or a little dam or a little nest to stop the chicks and the eggs rolling out, whatever it is, if we can control our environment, we do it. And for for all apes,
human beings especially,
all apes show signs of morality and fairness and all these different ideas. But for human beings, more than any other, a social environment is very, very critical. And for me, when you make a moral prescription, what you're doing, you're not deciding how you should act. You kind of know that anyway, right? You don't need, we wouldn't need to spend so much time dwelling on morality if it was just about our own behavior.
Totally.
It's about the behavior of other people. So when I say, Jordan Peterson gave a great example of this, though he didn't realize it. He talked about monogamy, and he talked about in terms of the sperm bank approach or the monogamy approach. And then he said that people would be, in his view, most societies have championed monogamy, right? And so that shows that we have an intrinsic idea that monogamy is moral. And so if you're not monogamous, you're going to feel guilty about it. So he would say his normative argument is you're better off being monogamous because actually you'll feel better about it. That was kind of what he was saying. But
Yeah,
for me,
that's a terrible argument.
For me, that's underpinned by the misunderstanding. And our idea of monogamy being moral, it's about ourselves. Right. It's me telling myself to be monogamous, but it's not about how does that benefit me? I don't need to do that. Me being monogamous is telling you not to shag my wife and my wife not to shag you effectively. Right. It's about everybody else. It's about how we're trying to control everybody else. Now, to be seen as a credible moral agent, we have to take part in that contractarian approach and listen to the moral prescriptions of everybody else and be seen, at least be seen to some extent, to be living by the standards that we're espousing to everybody else. But ultimately it's about controlling everybody else. And the point I brought that point up with Jordan Peterson is because it was only a few minutes later that he made it. I didn't actually know this statistic, but he said that on average, you have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. Now, I know that the reproductive success was different. I didn't know that that those were the ratios, and I assume that's looking at. They'll have looked at the Y chromosome DNA and the mitochondrial DNA. I assume is how they've done it, and they've worked out that you have twice as many female ancestors. That is because men have been going around sleeping around. Right. And the reason, if what he said was true and morality was about the self, and we had this general universal perspective on monogamy, then people wouldn't be doing that. But it isn't. This moral perspective on monogamy is telling everybody else, keep your prick in your trousers, mate. And don't drop your knickers to anybody who's going past. That's what it's about. It's not about limiting your own behavior as much as limiting everybody else.
He made a big show of the dominance hierarchy, and I think he would say that the reason for that discrepancy is that males have formed a dominance hierarchy where certain males are shutting other males out. And in our past, there wasn't necessarily a thing of sleeping with another man's wife. It was just one guy had like 100 wives and the other guys, had no wives. So I think that plays into kind of how we want to structure society or structure a morality in the future. For me, morality is very simple. Morality is just an agreed upon set of rules that we're all going to interact by. The problem with coming up with that set of rules is we all have, there's this constant war going on inside of everybody of what's good for me as an individual and what's good for me as a society, and kind of ironing out morality.
It is because it's a game you're playing where we're agreeing. It's highly contractarian. I'm telling, if you've got a million people,
dilemma is the game.
Yeah. A million people in society deciding on morality isn't a million people all describing how they're going to behave. It's a million people just saying how they want everybody else to behave effectively. And that's the discussions. They are the moral discussions that we have in society when we don't, without thinking about it. That's what's going on. If we start questioning it, that it's all the wheels are going to fall off. Right. And unless we've got a deity to start decreeing what's moral.
Don't go to the deity.
Yeah. Unless we have that, then the wheels are going to fall off.
The deity is going to create more arguments than not, I believe.
We're just going to keep doing the same thing that we always have done, actually, whether people believe in gods or otherwise, I think.
So the weak part of Jordan Peterson's argument with the dominance hierarchy for me is the fact that there's this guy, Chris Bohm, who's done a bunch of he basically has a working theory that once we evolve the ability to use tools and weapons, that reverse dominance hierarchies formed. And this is how we form these intuitions of egalitarianism that people have. Like this one guy who has 100 wives, who's the alpha male, and all the other males are shut out, right? Well, as soon as those other males evolve the ability to make spears and to cooperate, because that's one of the big differences between us and chimpanzees, our ability to cooperate without being relatives is just off the charts. So as
Yeah.
soon as you develop these reverse dominance hierarchies, everyone with a spear can get together and go kill the alpha male, right?
Yes.
And that's when monogamy became a thing, because every like spreading the reproductive resources around more evenly there was every incentive to do that, because as soon as you started hogging women, all the guys could gang up and kill you, right?
Yeah. But whether that has led to or required a change in our instinctive understanding of morality, I'm not sure that it has, because I think we'd had an understanding. The understandings of fairness cut across the whole primate lines, don't they? They do experiments with capuchin monkeys.
They do, yeah.
So that's kind of what underpins it. So yes, you might have some guy who because of his status has access to 100 wives, and all the others can do is to try and sneak a sexual encounter with one of them behind his back, which is of course seen as one of the potential mating strategies. I know people like David Buss have suggested that could be a forerunner of rape or whatever. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's his contention. But it doesn't mean that everybody regarded that as fair at the time. It was just hard shit, effectively, wasn't it? It's like
the sneaking around thing.
No, I mean the fact that somebody's got 100 wives and you haven't got one.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you're regarding that as moral. It's just that there's not really that much you can do about it. You might regard that as highly unfair, and it's not what you would go for. If somebody said to you, "Are you happy with this societal situation?" If you had a voice in this, is this how you would structure things? You'd say no.
This was the beginning of the divergent moralities, okay? Because the guy who had the 100 wives had a different morality than the guys that were gathering up their spears, right? The guys that were gathering the guys that were gathering up their spears to go off this guy, they had a completely different morality. It was like, we want to share the females. That's our morality.
Although the guy with 100 wives might not, he wouldn't necessarily think it was fair if you said, "Is this the moral way?" Well, no, but I've got 100 wives and you haven't. So,
exactly. This is how morality forms. It really does. A morality is an emergent property of everybody's opinions. But the 100 guys with the spears, they had more opinions. They did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, wait a second. Now we have feminism, though. So we're the 100 wives get an opinion, right? Back then they didn't. Their opinion didn't matter.
Exactly. So. No, and this is the other thing with regard to this is that the Sam Harris aspect, and of course his kind of approach is trying to boil it down to something simple and calculable, and I haven't read his book, The Moral Landscape. I'll be honest. I've heard him talk about it.
Snoozer, man.
Yeah, well, I've heard him talk about it on numerous occasions and debates and talks and stuff. So I've got some idea of where he's coming from with it. But what is interesting on this, and it's tangentially related, but it sort of put it into contrast with me, is that I read Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence.
I've read that as well.
Yeah, right. So you'll know that in that book, he talks a lot about a singleton getting a decisive strategic advantage. And of course, the dangers of how we codify it, and in terms effectively of morality. And one of the things, I don't know if you got the same enjoyment as me, but I got the enjoyment of reading a few pages, and he'd give examples of things which on the face of it seemed pretty basic, decent sets of rules, such as one of the ones, of course, is maximizing pleasure. Maximize human pleasure. So the singleton goes around and we rewires all our brains so that we're all permanently orgasming or in ecstasy all the time. And of course, that's a horrifying situation. That's not what we mean at all. And yet, in terms of this simplistic approach, this calculable approach to morality, right, it fits the criteria. So you have to keep adding all these little curlews and complications to it, and before you know it, you've got back to a human being. And this is the kind of approach Bostrom suggests, isn't it? Which is that effectively you need some kind of modified system that we go through to codify this super intelligence. But you've got to get it right the first time, of course. That's his major point, isn't it? But it's got to be a kind of learning process that looks at what we do within certain parameters,
Right.
and kind of works it all out. But as he says, it's so difficult to try and code morality. It's a lot easier to talk about it than it is to actually code it.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I completely disagree with Sam on, is the reductionist approach. And Jonathan Haidt, I think Jonathan Haidt, if you haven't read his book, The Righteous Mind, I completely suggest that you do, because
I'll make a note of that, actually.
His understanding of morality just makes perfect sense to me. And it's getting in, like in a lot of the sciences, reductionism works. I don't think in complex systems like human beings and emergent morality, reductionism is our friend. And
no,
a lot of people, especially in the skeptic community, are reductionist by almost by nature, it seems. So
yeah, I just, to me, it makes it, I don't understand the purpose of the project. It's to me, it's akin to creating. Well, can we create a machine that tells us what food we're going to find tasty or what music we should enjoy? Right? It's kind of absolutely worthless, because at the end of the day, you just refer back to assess the machine. You refer back to what you do enjoy or what you do find tasty. So you're making something that's reflecting your own prejudices. You're not going to buy it if this morality algorithm or machine or anything starts telling you that you need to start chopping babies up. You're not going to start chopping babies up, are you?
Yeah,
you're going to ignore what it's telling you and create another machine until it tells you what you want to hear, effectively.
Yeah. Hopefully that machine doesn't have too much power. That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we've been going for a good hour and a half here. So I was thinking maybe we'd close up, but I wanted to ask you. So we're talking about morality. Do you have a personal morality, or do you have? I mean, what is your morality, or what is your take on what morality?
It's a meta-ethical take. I don't know. I suppose you would say I'm a prescriptivist.
Doing to others
in terms of, well, in terms of a sort of golden rule or something like that. What I always say is that
I mean the creationists, we all know that you're just a heathen. You don't have more because God didn't come down and bestow it on you, you fucker.
In terms of normative questions, how ought we to behave? What I usually say, and it doesn't always satisfy people, is that isn't really what morality is about. It doesn't. It's morality is our way. It's my way of influencing you. It's not about. There's nothing out there that we're searching for. We're trying to uncover these moral truths. And if only we knew, if only we could get the perfect set. There isn't a perfect set. It would depend based on circumstance, based on culture, based on society, based on how everybody feels about it. So it is effectively, however distasteful it may seem, it is a business of horse trading. If there's any objectivity in it, in terms of moral judgments or decisions or ways that we act, the best that you could say is what would be in every, what if everybody is adopting, if everybody has to adopt the same moral terms, given the purpose of morality, which is, from my perspective, for everybody else to act in a way that is not harmful to me, that benefits me, that is benign to me at the very least, right? If everybody is playing the same game and everybody has to play by the same rules, which we have to because there's this sort of contractarian way that we do it, what you could say is, let's try and figure some rules out, a set of solutions that best fit that rule set. And so, as you say, I mean, the golden rule is something that has been, there's sort of 80 different versions of it. It crosses all cultures. And so in terms of morality and in terms of societies where everybody is generally equal, which is what we're heading towards, that's the kind of society that we're in, then you're probably right. A golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, is probably not a bad starting point, really, because of the contractarian nature of it. You know, it means that everybody's putting themselves in everybody else's shoes effectively, and creating effectively, it's a very benign form of morality that you're putting out there as a result of that.
Yeah. It's a tough one. It's a tough one.
It is, yeah, it is. But like I said, I don't think any of those discussions are helped by the fact that immediately I'll go and have a moral discussion with somebody in 2 days' time, and I will probably start talking about morality as if it's all about my own behavior, you know, because it's such an easy kind of language to slip into.
Oh, man.
Even God does it, doesn't he? The 10 Commandments.
The subjective nature.
Well, the 10 Commandments, it's not about how God acts, is it? He's not saying, well, I better not murder and kill. Even religion's the same thing. It's God telling, no, this is how I act. This is how you're supposed to act.
Yeah. The subjective objective divide, it amazes me that conversation is still going on, that people still take the objective morality path. You're not an objective morality guy, right?
No, I'm not. No, like I said, there could be some objectivity in terms of what moral statements you should make, given why we evolved morality. If you can understand separating that from viewing morality as something separate from us. Right. You know, same way as I could say, I can't say objectively that curry tastes nice, but I could say objectively, given that we've evolved a sense of taste to stop us eating things which are poisonous, things which are rotten, that you could say, given that purpose, that food shouldn't taste nice, or that food should taste nice. So there's some objectivity in there, but how useful that is in terms of our moral discussions, I don't know.
There are people on both sides of the theist and atheist debate that argue for objective.
There are, yeah, but because people see such danger. Somebody linked me actually on Twitter. I've got to have a look at it over the next day or so. Prague University on their YouTube channel has just put a video out.
And they always come down to semantic arguments.
Yeah, well, they've put this video. Why something like, unless there's a God. Why, unless there's God, we can all go around murdering people or something like that. So
I worked on a response video for that yesterday.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to have a look at that. So that's a little thing for later in the week, I think.
So do you want to say anything in closing before I shut down the stream?
No, not really. No, I've enjoyed the conversation. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground actually there, and it's all segued nicely into one another, I think.
I thank you for having the discussion with me.
I've enjoyed it. Yeah, really good.
Very nice. So I'll stop the stream. Thank you for listening, everyone, and I'll stop the stream and you stay on the line.
Okay.